You want one word, radical, and it's certainly a radical machine.
Hi, my name is Syd Bolton, and I worked on my first personal computer when I was only 10 years old. It was actually an Apple II, and not long after that, I tried out the very first IBM PC, the Model 5150. Maybe you don't know it as that, but it was definitely the first PC that ever came out. It wasn't a long time after that I actually went back to school after the long summer break, and I found out that my school actually had a computer, and it turned out that it was a Commodore PET. And soon after that, my love for all things Commodore started. You see, with the PET, I got to spend almost every single weekday working on the machine, and before long, I was consuming every bit of material that I could find, that I could read, and that I could use on this machine, and it turned out that it was a great thing for me. In the early 80s, knowledge was definitely power, and to a lesser degree, the same thing applies today. The problem is that there were few books on the subject of personal computers and certainly programming them, so any bit of information that you could find seemed like it was golden. It's not like today. There was no usable internet, and so it made it very difficult to find access to good information. Yes, it's true that bulletin board systems did crop up, especially in the mid 80s, but not everybody could afford a modem, and certainly if you were going to use it for more than a little bit every day, you had to get an extra phone line because it was very difficult for other members of your family and your household to use the phone when you were downloading a particularly large file. I used to dream about owning my own personal computer. If you're like me, maybe you flip through the catalog of consumers distributing, for those who know what I'm talking about, and I wanted to get my own computer, but at 12 I didn't have a lot of options. My parents weren't really in a position to afford to be able to buy me one, so I did what any responsible 12-year-old did. I went out and I got myself a job. My jobs were limited at that time, and I ended up getting a paper route. I saved up my money, and eventually I took my $321 and I went to Canadian Tire and I bought myself a VIC-20. Probably the best $321 I ever spent. I got everything with it. I got the cassette deck, software, even a gym bag, everything. $321. And I went home and I hooked it up to a used black and white TV. I used to dream about what the VIC would actually look like in color, and the next school term I was able to find out. That's right, they had a VIC-20 and they had it hooked up to a 5-inch color TV. It was small, but at least it was in color. The following year, my life changed forever. My parents' financial problems disappeared, and I remember my father asking me to make a list of everything that I'd ever wanted as a child. Well, of course, the first thing I put on the list was a waterbed, because after all, it was the 80s. And after that, I put on things like a Commodore 64 and an Apple II. Now, the Apple II, I'd never actually seen one in person, but I had seen one on this television program called Bits and Bytes. Bits and Bytes was on TV Ontario, and it was followed immediately by a television program called The Academy. This was the first time I'd ever had an introduction to a man named Jim Butterfield. I remember thinking to myself, he looks very wise. The other first memory I have of him is the way he pronounced cassette. It was a little bit different than I had ever pronounced it, being cassette, but he said it in such a way that it was distinctive, and at the time, I wasn't sure if he was American or Canadian or what he was. It was just how he emphasized the word. I mean, really, what did I know? I was 12. And then there was TPUG, the Toronto Pet Users Group. TPUG was a perfect place for someone like Jim to end up. It was a group of people getting together, and it's still alive today, sharing knowledge and information about Commodore computers. I remember that TPUG had actually a couple of publications it was associated with. One was Transactor, and the other was the Toronto Pet User Group magazine, or TPUG magazine. And Jim wrote articles for both. I remember reading an ad in an early issue that was from a lady who was looking for help with her 1526 printer. Her name was Anne. I had seen some articles somewhere else, and I thought maybe I could help her, so I wrote her back. We ended up becoming pen pals of a sort, and as her involvement with TPUG increased, so did mine. Eventually, I wrote some letters to Jim Butterfield. I don't even remember what the topic of the first one was, but I do know that I was hoping he wouldn't think that I was just a big fan writing to him and asking him a lot about nothing, which is really what I was doing at the beginning. He wrote back to me, though, and he gave me a list of all the computers that he had. And this list was pretty amazing. In fact, I still have that letter today, and it's proudly displayed here in the Personal Computer Museum. I did write him a letter after that, and I discussed what we were calling freeform programming. Jim really liked the topic, and when he wrote me back his response, he asked me if he could actually use the letter as a topic for one of his columns. He asked my permission, and of course I said yes, but I had to check with my parents because at the time, remember, I was still underage. When I finally reached the tender age of 16, I was old enough to drive myself and a few of my friends down to a TPUG meeting that Jim was attending. I think it was in Mississauga or something like that, I'm not really sure. But I remember one of my friends was slightly underwhelmed at what Jim had to say at that meeting. Jim talked about the shift return and how it was sort of something that could save you when you were in a tight pinch writing some code. And what I had to remind him then and even recently is that, Jim knew a lot of things. He knew more than we did. But when he was talking to general masses, he had to talk at a level that everyone could understand. What I had to remind my friend was that we were at an advanced level by this time. We were actually running our own bulletin board system. I wrote the code and he was running the system. And we did a lot of things like cracking programs and other stuff that just were beyond the scope of most users. I also remember at that time, it was the first time that I ever got an autograph from Jim. And I used to carry around a little pocket guide that was able to tell me exactly what I was doing that week and the week after. And, you just never know when you're going to need a Commodore 64 memory map. Inspiration is a wonderful thing. Inspiration that leads to motivation is a powerful thing. As time marched on, I saw Jim less and less. We'd occasionally cross paths at maybe a World of Commodore, and I remember seeing him when Commodore finally closed its doors back in 1994. We both stood around and looked as the once great empire had folded, and I could see a bit of sadness in his eyes. But even then, as I talked to him about how I was actually making a living writing Amiga software, he encouraged me. He told me that people were going to need me and my software more than ever. And you know what? He was absolutely right. I held on as long as I could, and I wasn't doing it just because of the words of one person or because I was foolish. I really felt like what I was doing was important, and that's something that Jim inspired in me and in many of you. I know that the days that I did write that software and I stayed in the Amiga market for as long as I did, I forged friendships that will last forever, and I will always look back at those days as some of the best in my life. I last saw Jim at the 25th anniversary World of Commodore, hosted by TPUG in December 2006. He did look a little tired from the chemo, but even so, in his condition, he was still willing to help me. We talked about the museum, and we stayed in touch after that, and we spoke on the phone and via email several times in the months and weeks that followed. Even a few weeks before he passed, Jim was talking to me about the museum and what he could do to help. He was exactly what a hero should be. He never faltered, and he was always willing to help me, and I appreciated everything he said and everything that he did. What strikes me most about Jim and about the stories that I hear from the people that talk about him today is how really everybody's story is somewhat similar to mine. I think everyone can identify with the fact that Jim helped us. He helped us inspire something inside us that propelled us forward. There's a lot of people today in the IT industry that have read Jim's books, read his articles, and learned something from him and continued forward because of his teachings and the things that he made us believe in. And that's really important. And it's something that I didn't see anyone else at the time doing. And that's really what Jim meant to me and why he was really important. Commodore may be gone, and so is Jim, but you can rest assured they will not be forgotten. I used to tell people that vintage computers are interesting because of the emotions that seem to be attached to them, but it's not really the computers. It's the people that really make the difference, and they really color the emotions that we have over the years and the way we feel about things. And Jim, well, Jim wasn't a color, he was a rainbow. You will be missed, Jim, but you will never, ever be forgotten.